Earlier this week, Jim Trotter filed a lawsuit against the NFL for racial discrimination. It's been one of the major stories surrounding the league this week, and today I have the pleasure of talking to the man himself about this suit and the impact that he hopes it will have. So joining me now is veteran journalist and current columnist for The Athletic. That would be Jim Trotter, who joins me now. Jim, how you doing, man?
Good, I'm good, Dexter. I appreciate you having me, man.
No, I appreciate you here to have this conversation and talk about it. And so, Jim, we're going to start from the top for our viewers. You filed this lawsuit against the NFL, and I'm giving you a two-part question here. What was the decision-making process in suing the league, and why did you feel that now was the time to do this?
Yeah, well, first of all, if the league is going to say publicly that diversity, equity, and inclusion are core principles and something that it values, then I felt that its actions should reflect its words. And so for the last couple of years, internally, I've been pushing to address the fact that in our newsroom, we did not have one black manager, we did not have one black copy editor, and we did not have one full-time black news assistant. And so my point to them was, how can we say, or how can we credibly cover a player population that is 60 to 70% black when they don't have any representation at the table when decisions are being made about how to cover them and who covers them and what the angle is. And so again, internally, I had been bringing this up for 2 years and asking this question and not getting anyone to address it with me. And so finally, I decided that was the point I had to go public with it and ask the commissioner about it at his Super Bowl State of the League press conferences. And so I asked him 2 Super Bowls ago about this, and in the context of Brian Flores' lawsuit, racial discrimination lawsuit, about the fact that the NFL has a long and painful history as it relates to race. And going back to the 1930s and 40s, where black players were banned from the league for a dozen years, through the 50s, 60s, and 70s, where we were not allowed to play certain positions because they said they were thinking man's positions, and then carrying that forward into the 80s and 90s, where we didn't have black coaches up until Art Shell, and we didn't have a black general manager until Ozzie Newsome in the early 2000s. And so as you keep going forward along that timeline, more recently, you get into the whole thing about race norming, this despicable aspect of race norming that was applied to the concussion settlement and how that was impacting black men. And so I just kept pushing to say, if the NFL is going to be who it says it is, then it has to walk the walk, and it wasn't walking the walk. And so in November, knowing that I had ruffled some feathers, I had my agent reach out to the NFL, to the media group, to see what my status was, knowing that my contract was coming up in March. And so he talked to Sandy Nunes, who was the VP over talent and whatnot, and said, "Hey, what are you guys thinking?" And she told him that we can't envision any reason we won't bring Jim back. Everybody loves him, but there may be a pay trim because we're going through budget cuts. And so my agent called and relayed that to me, and I'm like, cool. So that's November. Now fast forward to March, after the Super Bowl press conference, Sandy asked to meet with me, and her question to me was, are you in alignment with the newsroom? And I said, no, I can't be in alignment with a newsroom that doesn't have black representation. And she said, she goes, that's what I thought. That's what I thought. And she said, well, sometimes you have to compromise. It's tough to fight corporate headwinds. And I said to her, Sandy, I've compromised here, here, and here. And I said, the one thing I'm not going to compromise on is my integrity. And then I explicitly asked her, are you now saying my contract's not being renewed? And she said, I don't know, it's being discussed. 3 weeks later, I was told it was not being renewed. So why am I filing this lawsuit? Number one, what they did was wrong. To be retaliated against for trying to hold the NFL to the standards that it asked us to hold it to was wrong. And number two, trying to make a change within the NFL and within the newsroom in particular, to say that black people matter, black men matter too, and that you can't continue to say publicly that diversity, equity, and inclusion matter to you and are core principles if it doesn't apply to black people and black men.
And when I hear you say that and tell that story there, Jim, in your time of working with NFL media, I know that this is a discrimination suit, but based on what you just said there and told the story of how that all played out from your side, is there also a retaliation angle here? Is that part of the fight here as well for you too?
Oh, absolutely. It's part of the lawsuit. It is a retaliation discrimination lawsuit. So without question, I feel I was retaliated against for speaking out. I'll tell you a story. So every summer, the NFL Media Group has what they call a talent summit. It's where they bring in all of the media group to talk about where the league is and where it is going for the upcoming season, points of emphasis, all those sorts of things. And so within that day and a half of meetings, we have breakout sessions. And one of the breakout sessions, they take front-facing talent and you meet with the head of the media group, who at that time was Mark Quinzel. And there's about a dozen or so of us in there. And he says, this off the record conversation, you can ask anything you want, and I'll answer it honestly. And so I raised my hand. I said, Mark, we can ask anything we want, right? And he said, yes. I said, I just heard you in the ballroom before the large group talk about the improvements that have been made in diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I said, on the stage with you were three white males. There was no one who looked like me. I said, so how do I balance what you are saying with what I am seeing? I said, we have no black managers in the newsroom and we have no full-time black news assistants. And he stopped me and he said, yes, we do. And I said, no, we don't have any black full-time news assistants. He said, yes, we do. And so Hans Schroeder, who's one of the NFL executives out in New York, was in the meeting and he tried to step in. And I said, no, Hans, I said, I need an answer on this. And I said, Mark, if you give me one name, just one, of a full-time black news assistant, I said, I will drop this whole subject and never bring it up again. And he paused and looked at me and he said, I can't think of it right now. I'll get back to you. That was in June of 2022. I still have yet to hear back from Mark Quinzel.
Wow. Not hearing anything back on that at all whatsoever, which is part of the reason you are fighting this fight right now. I want to talk about, Jim, there's some headlines that have come out of your suit. There's the allegations of owners of the Bills and the Cowboys making some offensive comments. Can you discuss those comments and your reactions to them, as well as what the alleged comments may speak to in terms of culture within the NFL?
Yeah, the first one about Terry Pagula, about, referring to player activism and social activism, where he's alleged to have said if blacks don't like it here, they should go back to Africa and see how bad it really is. That came up during a Zoom call where there were more than 40 people from the newsroom on it during the pandemic. And one of the reporters, and you could tell this reporter was really uncomfortable, raised his hand and started to tell this story, and then said this on the Zoom call that Terry Pagula had said this to him. And so the Zoom call went on, and as we got to the end of it, it was never brought up again. And I raised my hand because I wanted to see what the reaction would be. And I said, are we not going to address what we've just heard? And the two managers on the call said, this is the first we're hearing of it. We want to talk to the reporter about it, and then we'll figure out how to go forward. So after that, I was told they talked to the reporter and they notified the New York offices that this had been alleged. And so every week I was asking, what's been done about this? What's being done? And all I kept getting was New York is investigating this. And then finally, after X number of months, my supervisor comes back to me and says, I have an answer for you and you're not going to like it. And I said, well, what's that? He said, they now say it's an HR matter and that's it. I said, oh, so we're going to sweep it under the rug. And he said, I'm just telling you what I've been told. And that was the end of it, and never heard anything else about it. The Jerry Jones comment was said directly to me. I happened to be on the sideline talking to Will McClay, who's the Cowboys' top personnel guy. We were talking about HBCUs and why HBCU players weren't being drafted. Will McClay is black. And Jerry Jones comes walking over, and I've known Jerry for some years. And so I said to Jerry, why do you all have such a hard time hiring black people in decision-making positions? And I caught him off guard, understandably. And he starts giving me an answer about blacks get 70% of the revenue in the league, et cetera, et cetera. And I said to him, number one, Jerry, that's not true. I said, but number two, that's not what I ask you. What I ask is, why do you all have such a hard time hiring black people in decision-making positions? And again, he gave me some strange answer that didn't make sense. And so I said to him a third time, that's not what I asked you, Jerry. Why do you all have such a hard time hiring black people in decision-making positions? And by this time, his son, Stephen, had walked up. And Jerry said to me, Jim, I'm starting to get a little defensive. And I said, Jerry, I'm not talking about you individually. I'm talking about owners as a collective. I said, I supported your candidacy for the Hall of Fame. So it's not about that. I said, I just want to know why you all have such a hard time hiring black people in decision-making positions. And that's when he looked at me and his facial expression changed. And he said, if blacks feel some kind of way, they should buy their own team and hire who they want to hire. And I said, oh, there it is. And so I said to him, I said, well, let me ask you, are you all going to change your guidelines for purchasing a franchise then? I said, because if we say conservatively that the next franchise is going to sell for $4 billion, and knowing that your guidelines say up front, an owner, a primary owner, has to write a check for 30% of the value of the club at the time of sale. I said, how many people do you know, and how many black people in particular do you know who can write a check for $1.2 billion? I said, not have a net worth of 1.2, but write a check for 1.2 billion. And that's when he brought up, he said, one of the people he mentioned, he said, Jay-Z. And I shot back at him and said, Jay-Z can't write a check for 1.2 billion unless his wife gives him half of it. And by this time, Art Rooney had walked up, the owner of the Steelers. And then Jerry said, well, look, why don't can we agree to disagree? And I said, yeah, we can agree to disagree. And I told Art, what we were talking about. And I actually complimented Art on the Steelers for being one of the leaders as it becomes in the field of diversity, equity, and inclusion as it relates to NFL. And that was the end of the conversation there. And that's where it stood. And I remember at one point within the culture that you talk about of the NFL, when the John Gruden emails came out and John Gruden resigned from the Raiders, I was supposed to be on air that day. And I told my supervisors that in discussing the culture within the NFL in terms of how it treats black people, I wanted to bring up this story about Jerry Jones. And they told me not to. They said, well, if you say this, it's going to blow up. And I said, yeah, I understand. And they said, well, we need to talk about it more. And I said, basically, you're saying then that I need to go ask Jerry Jones, Jerry, did you actually say this to me? Did I hear you right? And if he says no, then I have to call myself a liar. That wasn't okay with me. So I was not allowed to tell that story on the air. But to your point, this speaks to a larger issue, as I outlined earlier, about the NFL's relationship with race, and in particular, blacks and black men. So imagine being an employee in this media group, and yet everything that relates to black men, as we are seeing, particularly in positions of authority, is negative. And I went on the air that day when they said I couldn't talk about Jerry, and I opened up by saying, I am exhausted at the attacks on black people in this league and us having to defend ourselves. The fact that John Gruden in those emails would talk about a black man as having Michelin lips, and he would feel comfortable enough saying that to a team president who is a person right under the owner, and there are no consequences to that, and that club executive is comfortable having that conversation with John, it speaks to a culture where folks are comfortable enough to talk about us in that way. And that is a problem to me. And this is what I have been fighting to change and hopefully bring change to. And as I do this, I do it with risk to myself. I understand that financially, professionally, all of those things, but I also know it has to be done because I can't continue to complain about the things that are wrong if I'm not willing to stand up and fight for the things that are right. And I'm trying to make this better for the people who are coming behind me so that hopefully they don't have to experience some of the same things that you and I and others have experienced in this journalism field. And so that's really what this is all about for me, is trying to hold some people accountable who are not accustomed to being held accountable.
I think a couple things there that you said. One, about the accountability, which obviously is so important, especially in this field of journalism, in all walks of life and in all professions, but also the comfortability in the stories that you shared. And even we know with the Gruden one that people were comfortable to say these things around other people, which is really disturbing and disappointing. Also, in your lawsuit, Jim, you claimed that the league wanted to resume the Bills versus Bengals game last season, where the cardiac arrest incident involving Buffalo safety Damar Hamlin occurred. Did you try to investigate that situation, and how did that play out for you?
Oh, absolutely I did, because after that game, just like other reporters, we had been hearing stories about that. Remember how the teams began warming up?
Yep.
And so the league had said it never told the teams to warm up and whatnot. Well, we were getting contradictory information. And so I reached out to several sources who had told me that, yes, in fact, from the command center in New York, they had notified the point of contact at the field that there would be a 5-minute warm up, after which the game would resume. And so I was given a name of a person who had given those instructions from the league office. And so I reached out to that person, called his cell phone, and never got a response. So I texted my two supervisors at the media group, and I said, hey, is this still the number you have for this person? I'm not getting an answer. I got no response. So then I reached out to the NFL executive. I reached out to Troy Vincent, and I said, I'm being told this went down. Is this true? And Troy basically said to me, you saw my statement this week. I never told anyone to do anything, et cetera, et cetera. And I said, Troy, I never said you said it. I said, I'm asking if this other person actually said this. Troy didn't respond after that. So then I reached out to Brian McCarthy of the NFL Communications Department. And I said, hey, I'm trying to reach this person. It's about this story, the Damar Hamlin story. I've been told this. I said, I'd like to talk to this person and see if this is true. Brian McCarthy told me that this person had denied this strongly, that it wasn't true, that it's a non-story. And I said, I understand. I said, I just need to hear it from this person, and then we can go forward. And he said, why are you doing this? He goes, this story's in a good place now. Why are you doing this? And I said, because as a journalist, my job is to pursue the truth. And he said, if you continue with this, I'm going to have to call your supervisor. I said, okay, I'm comfortable with that. You can call my supervisor. Well, we get off the phone, and within 10 minutes, I get a text message from my supervisor telling me to stand down on this story, that he's comfortable with where it's at, and if that changes, he will let me know. And so I texted him back and I said, I thought our job as journalists was to pursue the truth. Has that changed? And he never responded to me. And so the story died from our end.
Seems, Jim, like there's a lot of questions you ask and you're not getting responses to, which is disturbing in this whole situation here. But thank you for sharing these stories once again about what's been going on from your side and your experience. I also want to ask you this. NFL Commissioner Roger Goodell, he appeared on ESPN's First Take a day after the news of your suit broke. He suggested that the league will investigate the situation, and Goodell stated this. He said, quote, we share the same concern. We want to make sure our workplaces are first class, and that means opportunities for everyone. We know the importance of progress and diversity, and we're working very hard at it. I'm confident that we are moving in the right direction, end quote. Now, you've challenged the commissioner on diversity in the league's hiring policy in the past.
Can I address that for 1 second?
Yes, please, go ahead.
Yeah, no, how many years have we been hearing that, right? That's always the fallback answer, that we need to do better, and we're going to do better, and we're going to investigate ways to do better. The first year that I asked him at the Super Bowl about the lack of diversity in the newsroom in certain areas, what did he say? We've fallen short. We're going to review all our policies, practices, and procedures to try and improve, et cetera. A year later, nothing had changed. And that's when I asked him about it again at the Super Bowl. So for me personally, you know, I'm tired of lip service. I'd rather see action, real meetings. I have been trying to get the NFL to give me its promotion and retention rates for the demographic groups within the NFL, because my understanding anecdotally is that when it comes to promotion and retention, blacks rank at the bottom or near the bottom of retention and promotion. So that will tell us a lot, and I'm sure that will come out in discovery in our lawsuit. So as to him appearing on Stephen A's show, it was clear that my lawsuit had not been read prior to Stephen questioning the commissioner, because if he had, when Goodell said that I was terminated simply for budget reasons, I would ask him, when did Sandy Nunes find out that there were going to be budget cuts? Because she mentioned that to us in November when we called about my contract situation, and even acknowledged then that I may have to take a pay trim because they were going to have budget cuts. So what transpired between that November and March when I was let go? The only difference was I asked the commissioner about the league's record on diversity and inclusion, equity and inclusion, and that didn't go over well, to the point that my immediate supervisor asked my colleague the next day, why does Jim keep bringing this up? We have a diverse newsroom. And my colleague had to explain to him why I continue to bring this up. So from that standpoint, the league continues to say these things publicly about diversity matters to them. And let's be clear here. When we talk about diversity, when the league talks about diversity, it is talking about all minority groups, whether we're talking gays, whether we're talking white women, whether we're talking Asians, whatever. my concerns have specifically been about Black people. Because if you have an NFL where the wealth of these owners is built largely on the backs of Black players, and they don't have representation in the newsroom and at the highest levels of the league where decisions are being made about them, to me, that is a problem, and the players should be concerned about that as well.
Yeah, I think we actually all should be concerned about it, and I'm glad for you to respond to those comments that Roger Goodell had there. And Jim, your points just there about journalism and diversity and all of this stuff. As a fellow journalist, as a fellow Black man, you and I both know the issue with diversity isn't just an NFL issue or NFL media problem.
Correct.
In fact, it's an issue in most newsrooms and media outlets across the country.
Most corporations.
Right, most corporations. Where, to be quite frank, a lot of the people in positions of power, they look the same, right? Black people
Absolutely.
in particular and people of color, they've been talking about this for years. And then there's strong data showing the lack of diversity across newsrooms. So my question to you, and I'm not even sure you were the right person to have to answer this, but why do you believe that not much has changed? Is it just a lack of want to? Because why hasn't much changed there?
I think it starts with the leadership. So there has never been a majority Black owner in the NFL to this day. So if we aren't in the room when discussions are being made about what happens in this league, how do we really expect for change to happen? So what have we heard the NFL say of late? That prior to the Broncos franchise being sold, that they would give greater consideration to minority groups, particularly Black groups who are interested in buying a franchise. Well, 2 franchises have sold since then, the Broncos and the Commanders. And there were Blacks who were interested in purchasing those franchises. Didn't get it. So the NFL is going to say, well, there were teams that outbid them. Here's my belief, that if this is important to you, then you are intentional about going out and finding people who are qualified, capable, et cetera, to be in these positions. And we are out there, and yet we are not in these positions. So for me, it stems back to leadership, starting at the very top. And if we aren't involved and if we aren't a part of that, I don't think the NFL will ever understand fully how important this position is, or its position is in all of this. And I don't think we will ever see real change.
Well said there, Jim. Appreciate the words there. Last thing for me here. The suit has been filed. It's out. We have no idea how any of this is going to play out. But I have to ask you, what is your hope that this lawsuit will accomplish? If this works out perfectly, what do you hope that it accomplishes?
Change. I mean, change in the newsroom and change across the NFL where Black people are valued and where we see that they are valued and that they are in those decision-making positions to have an influence on how these players, coaches, executives, how they are covered, who covers them, and what the angles are. All I want is change. And, Dexter, that's what people tend to miss this. They see me questioning the commissioner and they think that's where this all started. They don't realize I had been questioning these things internally for 2 years. Anyone who knows me knows that I believe in the chain of command and that if I have an issue, I'm going to go to my immediate supervisor before I go to anyone else. And that's what I did here. That's where these conversations started. And every step of the ladder that I went up, I couldn't get anyone to address this. And so then I finally took it to the commissioner. So ultimately what I want is change. And that's the reason I'm filing this, because for me personally, I could not live with myself years from now if I, someone who is in a position to stand up and fight this, didn't do it, and this all continued, to go on for years and years and years. I may not be able to make change, and if I'm unable to make it, at least I know I did everything I could to try and make change. I didn't just talk the talk. I tried to walk the walk. I tried to stand up for what's right, in a situation that I knew what I was saying was wrong. So from that standpoint, that's all I want. And that's all I was asking them for, was change, was some representation. And I couldn't get anyone to move forward. Here's the thing, remember this. The first time I questioned Roger Goodell publicly, how many people from the league office do you think reached out to me and said, let's have a conversation. Let's see what we can do? How many people do you think reached out?
I'm gonna go out on a limb here, Jim, and I'm gonna guess 0.
Zero. So if you are serious about this and you have an employee who is bringing this to your attention at every level of the company, not one person from the New York office ever reached out to me and said, let's have a conversation about this. And that includes the commissioner.
Yeah, I think when you think about it just from that perspective, it's disappointing. If anybody in any organization brings up something and is asking for change, you would hope, and the key word I'm saying here is hope, that that organization will be committed to that change. But Jim, I want to say you gave me a lot of time here. So thank you, number one, for the time. We appreciate that, you sharing your side, your truth, bringing it out here, and also everything that's going on with your lawsuit. You're fighting for change, and I appreciate that as a fellow journalist, number one, also as a black man. So thank you so much for that, Jim, and thank you for the time. Appreciate you, man.
I appreciate you having me, Dexter.